Hi, and welcome to another edition of my Top 100 Games of the Decade. We are at the halfway point as we count down today from 50 to 41. We have seen the first 50 of my selection of my favourite games from the past decade, and we're going to get into the really good stuff now that we start getting towards the top. As usual, these games are entirely picked by me. They are my own personal picks for games of the decade. If you feel that something's missing, there is a chance that I just haven't played it, or it just isn't of interest to me. But I would be very interested in hearing some of your favourite games of the decade, as well as hearing some of your opinions on what games made it into mine. And without further ado, let's do number 50, shall we? So I've talked about the Tomb Raider trilogy that came out this decade, but the reality is the best Tomb Raider experiences for this decade did not come from the series called Tomb Raider. They came from the sub-series that was created called Lara Croft, which is separate. The only problem is that the Lara Croft series feels more like Tomb Raider than the Tomb Raider games. And Lara Croft and the Garden of Light, and what I have played of the Temple of Osiris, as well as the mobile game Lara Croft Go, felt significantly more Tomb Raider-y. Aside from the fact that they still use the classic Lara design and not the Camilla Luddington version, but it's also just the fact that they are centered around exploring ancient sites, figuring out puzzles, finding secrets, and that sort of thing. They lean into all of that much more than the main Tomb Raider series has done this decade, and that is why the Guardian of Light, and you may as well include the other ones while we're here, it's why it's this high. I loved Guardian of Light. I thought it was a really fun game, and it's also really clever in the puzzle design. I've played it both solo and co-op, and the experience is very different, and they've done a really good job of making the puzzles feel the same, but also work whether you're playing as one person or two people. And I just thought that there was some really innovative stuff going on with that. And yeah, I really liked Lara Croft and the Garden of Light. I would like more of the feel of this with the budget of the main series, and then I would be happy with the Tomb Raider series again. Firewatch is a really lovely little walk in the woods of a game. Literally, it is a walk in the woods, and that is really the game. It's like 2 to 3 hours of walking through these woods, talking on a radio, occasionally finding something that happens, and then it all builds up to an ending that a lot of people found very disappointing. And if that sounds bad, it's not bad. First of all, like, the atmosphere and the feel of this game is just brilliant. It feels so relaxing to play, but at the same time, everything's got this undercurrent of meaning, and you kind of get a lot with the character interactions, and you feel like this relaxing little walk, it's maybe not as great as it seems from the plot, especially because you get the intro with all of the backstory to this, and it's quite tragic. And that kind of sets the tone for the game. We do have some really great chemistry between the main character Henry and his boss Delilah, who they only ever communicate on the radio, but they have a lot of banter between themselves, and that's always fun. And while a lot of people were disappointed with this game's ending, I am not one of those people. I thought the ending absolutely worked for the kind of story that this told, and the kind of game that this is. I felt it all came together really nicely. I'm not going to spoil any of that, obviously, but it was just a really, really good experience. Just this really chill walk in the woods with an undercurrent of tragedy and struggle, and the nature of facing our problems was kind of the central theme of the whole game, and it was relaxing, but it was also contemplative at the same time. And as such, it has to be commended for all the good that it did. Ori and the Blind Forest is an absolutely beautiful game that backs up those visuals with just some superb gameplay. This game, a lot of the time, felt like some weird hybrid of Oddworld and Metroid. I kept getting those vibes throughout the whole thing. Obviously, this is very much a Metroidvania. You have this sort of fairly open, side-scrolling world where you have powers that you unlock gradually, and they allow you to go back and use them in different places, so therefore it's very Metroid in that sense, but just the tone of it in places, bits of it just really reminded me of Oddworld for some weird reason, even though it's a lot faster paced than Oddworld ever was. But it's got a lot of really fun stuff going for it in itself. A lot of the abilities are really fun to play around with. As you go further through the game, you get a lot more abilities that are focused on movement and jumping and sort of countering a lot of abilities, and they allow you to do a lot of really cool fast-paced maneuvers through the environment, and it's just a really fun time once you've got all those abilities chained together. It's really satisfying to play. It's a little bit frustrating in places, but not in a way that's unfair. It's a way that, you know, it tests your reflexes and it tests how you're playing, but every single step of the way it always feels like, okay, right, I misstepped here and I want to try and do better at that. I absolutely loved Ori and the Blind Forest, and I'm really looking forward to the sequel that's coming out early next year. I feel like if I say anything bad about this game, I'm going to have a bad time. That's not to say that I found anything particularly bad about this game, it's just I wanted to throw the meme in there right at the beginning. Yes, this is Undertale, which, okay, if I have to say something bad, I will say that I didn't quite latch onto it in the way that the internet did. I think it's one of those anti-hype things where something is so beloved by so many people and so many people are saying you should check it out, that when you check it out, it's alright, but it's not quite the magical thing that everyone said it was, which is no fault of the game itself, which is of course excellent. Yes, Undertale of course is very much the RPG that you can play without killing anyone, and you can have a full pacifist run and all of that stuff, and there's some really creative ways that they've made the monster sparing work, and just kind of getting to figure out the personalities of the different monsters that you fight. I thought that was really cool. It's also just got a really good sense of humour. A lot of the monster interactions are really fun, and you've got just, it's weird stuff like Papyrus's dating sim, which is ridiculous and hilarious in equal measure, and it's all topped off with this really astounding soundtrack. So much of the soundtrack of this game is just some of the best music I've ever heard in a game. We're talking things like the main Undertale theme, which was just such a beautiful piece of music, and obviously we all know the track that's playing right now, but just a bunch of other things like that really, and just, I don't think there was a single bad track on it, but at the same time just, it's all wrapped around this just brilliant game with brilliant writing, and you can see how it got the fan base that it did, and that's a good thing. Ninokuni is a really charming RPG, and a lot of that comes from the Studio Ghibli connection that it has, which was the main draw for me in the first place. Now, of course, Studio Ghibli are the beloved anime studio that made Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke and all that sort of stuff, and all of that visual magic that studio does with its films is here in this game. It looks great, and the music is great as well, because Joe Hisashi handled all of that as well, and it just sounds beautiful as a result. But of course, that alone doesn't make a great game, which is why it's good that underneath all of that there is a really good RPG built into this. It's quite a simplistic one, and it's clearly made with a slightly younger audience in mind, I would say. But at the same time, there's still plenty to like, even if you're not a child. It's quite a simplistic system, but with a lot of surprising depth, in the sense that like everything's easy to understand and easy to keep track of, but there's a lot of it at the same time, and you can play around with all sorts of different things with stats and all that, and it's really interesting for that. But also it tells a really sweet little story. It's very Ghibli-esque in its telling. It's about this other world, and this boy travels to this other world following his mother's death, and tries to put things right, essentially. And yeah, it's a really nice little story, and you're accompanied by just this loud, brash Welsh fairy who I absolutely love. He's the best. And yeah, there's a lot of charm and a lot of lovely things going on in Ninokuni, and I really enjoyed my time with it. And it is long, so it was a lot of time that I spent with this game. I fully admit that I'm not always on the ball with Pokemon games. Like, there are people who play every single one religiously. There are people who buy handhelds specifically to play Pokemon. I'm not one of those people. I kind of dip in whenever I feel like it. And I felt like it when Omega Ruby came out, and I really enjoyed it. Prior to Omega Ruby, the last game I'd played in the series was Diamond, which was good, but had a lot of real quality of life issues that are kind of just a holdover from just the nature of the game back on the Game Boy that just carried over. Pokemon Omega Ruby does away with a lot of it, and it makes things a lot more streamlined, a lot more fun to play, much easier to kind of navigate the world and get on with things. And I really liked what it was doing. I really enjoyed my time with Pokemon Omega Ruby as a result. It has a lot of polish, a lot of charm that you kind of expect out of Pokemon, and yeah, I did enjoy my time with Pokemon Omega Ruby. It was a really fun Pokemon game that reminded me why I loved it in the first place, and maybe eventually I'll get around to playing Sword and Shield. Maybe, I suppose. I think I'm due to jump in based on the generations and how often I play, so we shall see. But yeah, Pokemon Omega Ruby, really, really fun, really, really good game, and yeah, real high point for the Pokemon series as far as I'm concerned. I have zero shame in saying that Dissidia Duodecim Final Fantasy is the greatest Final Fantasy game of the 2010s. Yes, I'm looking at you, Final Fantasy 15, in your terrible demo that I hated. This and Type 0 were the only ones that I had any real fun with. Dissidia especially, because it is really just an action RPG disguised as a fighting game. It likes to call itself a fighting game. It's an action RPG where the focus is one-on-one fights. It's great at doing all of that. The mechanics are really solid, and they're very simple to pick up. Everything uses just two commands, which you use at very specific points, but the way that they've made each character unique with those two buttons, and the fact that you can customize the moves and play around with things, there's just so much love thrown into this that acts just a grand celebration of the Final Fantasy series in a way that even the main series itself seems unwilling to celebrate. It does have a couple of issues because of its adherence to the Final Fantasy series. The story is overwrought, I feel, and slightly overwritten, and takes itself way too seriously for what is just a silly crossover fighting game. and that is the problem with Square Enix today. And there is an element of grindiness, particularly if you're playing through like the main, like the later scenarios and stuff. Other than those things, it is still a really enjoyable experience, and I absolutely love this game. And it's a real shame that the sequel didn't quite live up to its promises, as a full home console HD version of Dissidia would be really nice to have, but sadly, it's just this one. The Sly Cooper series is always a good time, but Sly 4 really refined a lot of what the series did well. They took a lot of the core mechanics. They haven't really changed anything since the original trilogy on the PS2, but they did a really good job of bringing that onto the PS3 and really made it as fluid as possible and as enjoyable as possible. They also managed to avoid the problem that Sly 3 had, where you had all of these characters but the only one that was worth playing was Sly. By building a lot of it around Sly's family members, a lot of them played kind of like Sly but with unique abilities, and so it felt less like you were being forced to play a character who wasn't very good until eventually you could play Sly again, and instead it felt a bit more like you were playing Sly with new abilities, and as such the game felt a lot more enjoyable for that. It also really leaned into its time travel storyline with some really varied environments with a lot of stuff going on that I just really liked how they designed a lot of that, and just the variety on show, and there's some fantastic voice performances as well. It feels like a cartoon. I know a few people were slightly disappointed with how the story went in this, and it's a shame that we probably won't see more of the Sly series going forward, unfortunately, because this one didn't do too well, but I really enjoyed every moment of Sly 4, and I feel that it deserved better.
Au revoir.
One of my favourite RPGs of the 2000s was Valkyria Chronicles, which blended tactical wargame RPG style gameplay with third-person shooters, and that made it really stand out for me and made it really interesting. And Valkyria Chronicles 4 was the first time that it came back to a home console to the West for a while, and so I made sure to play it because I really wanted more of that game, and I was really happy to see that most of what made that first game so great is still intact in the fourth game. But they've also added a whole bunch of really cool stuff as well. So they added in things like a direct command feature for leader units, where you could have those leader units lead other people around the battlefield. And they also introduced the APC, both of which really opened up where you could position people and how you could move people around, and I really liked how they did that. They also added the Grenadier class, which added a really, really interesting element to it, because, I mean, while it was a really fun weapon for you to use, but also you had to bear in mind that the enemy now had them as well, it really helped change up tactics a lot. And a lot of really cool stuff. The storyline was still really good. It took a different approach. At first I was a little bit disappointed because it didn't really play up the kind of homegrown heroes vibe that the first game did and made that so appealing, but instead it went in a much darker war is hell kind of direction. But while it was different, it handled that really, really well as well. It was a worthy successor to an already great RPG. As we all know, I love the Uncharted series, but I can't rank Uncharted 3 any higher than this one. Yes, I'm going to start with some negatives on this one. The problem is, with Uncharted 3, it was rushed, and there are plenty of times where you can tell. The story drops a lot of really interesting narrative threads that it never picks up on ever again. What's more, there's a whole section in the middle of the game that could be removed from the game and would affect nothing in the rest of the game, and that's the ship section. A lot of that is very disappointing. It's enough to drag it down, in my opinion, of the game. They set up some really interesting stuff with the villains that never really paid off. That was another aspect of it, and it kind of was a bit lackluster for me as a result. They did their best with it, but the plot was a lot weaker in Uncharted 3 than it was in the other entries. But with that said, this is about celebrating great games. And well, with those issues aside, with the storyline, Uncharted 3 still largely has most of the elements that made Uncharted 2 such a brilliant game. And so, it's still a great game. It's just dragged down with some plot issues. But aside from that, still really, really good gameplay. Just was constantly being refined by this point and had improved on a few things from Uncharted 2. We also still had some really great character interactions that are the real appeal of the series, in my opinion. And it was still just a good, fun, swashbuckling adventure, even if ultimately there were some issues with its story and its structure that could have been fixed with a little bit more time. And that is it for yet another edition of this Top 100. We have counted down all the way down to number 41, and you have a good idea of what games I think are really, really good, and you're probably looking at me and being like, really? That okay, sure. But we've still got another 40 games to go. Oh boy, another 4 videos. But I promise you, there's some good stuff coming up. Really, really good stuff, and it may be difficult to stop me talking highly of a lot of these things. But I will see you again tomorrow with some more exciting games of the decade. I look forward to seeing you then.